Welcome back, everybody. We are now going to continue our discussion of natural selection. So, we've talked just a little bit about it and Darwin's four postulates, but we haven't gone deep into exactly how natural selection occurs and then also subtypes of natural selection. So, you've probably not thought as deeply about it as we could. And that is what we are going to do now. So, I'm just opening up our slides here. Okay, so here we have a beautiful pigeon or dove, and we're going to talk about why I've got that here in a little bit. But I want everyone to think for a minute. We've got to get some definitions in here. When we are talking about success or fitness in terms of natural selection, right, the most successful individual or the fittest individual, that is who is passing on the most genes. So, in the evolutionary sense, the individual that reproduces the most is the fittest. The more offspring you have, the more successful you are. So, it's not how long you live, because if you live a long time and only have a one offspring, and another individual lives half as long but has 10 offspring, they are fitter. They are passing on more genes. So, the fittest if we're looking at the population level instead of one individual, you could have one phenotype that is fitter, right? If the individuals that have that phenotype survive, that is the fitter phenotype that gets passed on. And you could end up with most individuals having that. So in our beetle example, right, the orange phenotype was the fittest phenotype. That was the most successful one. Okay, so now let's take that and think about it a little more. Let's say we've got two flies. One could survive long periods of time without food, and the other one has to eat daily to survive. Which one is more fit? So I want you to pause and think about this. Which fly is fitter? Okay, hopefully you've come up with an answer. And my guess is if we were able to take a poll of the class, most people would say that the fly that could go long periods of time without eating is the fitter fly. Am I right that people said that? But the actual answer is it depends. Right? It depends on the environment. Let's say the flies are in a place with very, very little bit amounts of food, right? Low food supply. Then, yeah, that fly that can go long periods of time without eating is going to be fitter. It can still go about its daily business without, starving to death, and it will then have time to find a mate and pass on its genes. But let's say those flies are in a place with plenty of food. Being able to survive without food is no advantage. And maybe there are costs to that, right? Maybe it can survive without food because maybe it has smaller wings that don't require as much energy to lift and fly. So maybe it doesn't look as nice to the female flies, or maybe it can't fly as well. And if this new environment has predators, maybe it's going to get eaten more quickly. Or maybe it's just hangry and has a bad disposition and can't find any female flies to mate with, right? So it's possible that in some environments, that is not an advantageous trait. So fitness depends on the environment. There's no way to know without seeing the individual in its environment. So a classic study that was done on this was in the Galapagos Islands in the 1970s by Rosemary and Peter Grant, and they've actually are still doing research there. So they have, like 50 years of data on these finches on Daphne Island. And what they were doing was they started off just kind of studying the birds and measuring them. They didn't know what their question was, right, until they were making observations, right? That's the first step. So in 1976, they caught every single bird on the island. There were 751 finches, and they measured their beak depth. And you can see that the beak depth at that point was about 9.5 was the average depth from top to bottom of the beak. There was a horrible drought in 1977 on the islands. This was associated with an El Nino event. Um, and then in 1978, when they came back, there were very few survivors. And now there were only 90 birds left on the island. So almost a 90% death rate, really, really high death rate. When they measured those birds, what they found was the beak depth had changed. The average beak depth was now about 10, so it had shifted. The individuals that survived were those with bigger beaks, and they then passed those big beaks down to their offspring. So let's look through Darwin's four postulates. The first is that there's variation in a trait. And we can see that there was variation. If we look on this chart on the left, before any selection occurred, beak depth ranged from 6, and there was one individual all the way up here with 14. Okay, from 6 to 14, that's a lot of variation. There is variation. Turns out it is heritable. They did pass that down to their offspring. The third is that more are born than reproduce. And certainly that's the case here. Many died, right? And that survival was not random. It's not just survival, but survival and reproduction, right? Because selection is on who reproduces and is passing on their genes, not random, right? So the big beaked individuals survived. Why is that? Well, it turns out that because of that drought, a lot of plants died. And the only food sources available were kind of thicker nuts and big seeds. And the birds that had a bigger beak depth were better able to open those seeds. So those individuals died. And you can see that our variation has decreased. Yeah, this one bird with a tiny beak did okay. It survived. But a lot of these died, right? So we've now skewed our population, and that's kind of the majority are now between like 8 and 12, where it used to really run from 6 to maybe 11 and a half was where most of them were. So when we're talking about fitness, we have to compare it to others in that population, right? So if on Daphne, when there's not a lot of food, the fittest birds averaged one offspring that year. That may not look good compared to like, a chicken somewhere that had, 12 offspring that year. But we need to compare it to where it was living, right? That was very fit for a finch on Daphne Island. So it was the fittest genotype there. And so it really depends on the environment, and it depends on the reproductive success compared to others in that population. You could even look at the same species of finch on a different island, but maybe they had more food, right? So you need to compare it to the population right there. So this beak size is an adaptation, and an adaptation, I know, I'm sure everyone in this, room has heard that term before. This is just a feature that makes an organism better suited to its environment. So it could be something physical that you can see, like camouflage, or it could be something like how fast their muscles twitch, which leads to speed, or the ability to make a certain sound, like an echolocation, or to make a toxin, or an adaptation could even be a behavior, like a social structure, like hunting in a pack. That's an adaptation. So adaptations are really anything genetically based that makes that organism better suited to its environment, so that it is fitter, so that it can reproduce more. But these adaptations and natural selection do not lead to the perfect organism, right? There's no such thing as perfection. Organisms can only adapt within the limits of their variation, right? So um, if this was our graph of beak size, and they're all kind of shaped, right? If this is our bird and all the beaks are kind of shaped like this, you are not going to from there get a bird with a big, with a toucan beak, right? That's not variation within that population. So it needs to be, yes, you can push the limits of how big or how small it is, but there's no variation for lots of colors on that beak, right? So we're not getting like a toucan beak here with lots of colors and a giant beak. Um, Organisms also cannot adapt because they want to or they need to. So organisms, those adaptations that come up are random. If we remember our Avita Ed Lab, right? Just because there's something in the environment that you would like to be able to take advantage of doesn't mean you get to. So even needing to does not lead to an adaptation. It is if there's variation or if a mutation shows up, but you can't plan to. And if the environment changes, maybe there'll be pressure for an organism to change back. So it's not always um, pushing always in one direction, right? Those beak sizes and which one is beneficial could shift. And different organisms might adapt differently to the same um, stimulus, like that same environmental condition, depending on what alleles they have. So maybe those finches adapted by having a big beak, but maybe another organism adapted to that drought by going longer without food or by switching what types of food they ate. Maybe instead of eating seeds, a different organism that had claws like was able to dig and find worms or something, right? So it's different. That same drought could result in selections for different traits in different organisms. Now, we can see a lot of this through our own artificial selections, right? And we talked about this when we talked about GMOs and how humans can selectively breed things, right, to get what we want out of them. And I showed the example of like cabbage and Brussels sprouts and things like that. They're all came from wild mustard. So humans over, many years have selected for specific traits that they want. And we started this lecture with a picture of a fancy pigeon. And Darwin actually was a pigeon breeder. And this helped him come up with his ideas, right? You start off with, a bird that looks like this, basic city pigeon. And if one of them has a little extra frill on its wing, you could just only breed the frilly pigeons together and just keep selecting those and eventually end up with a frilly winged bird, right? Or if you have a pigeon that hatches with very feathery feet, right? If you only breed the feathery feet individuals, eventually you'll end up with a population that looks like that. So Darwin saw that he could artificially select for certain traits. And if we can do it, and we've done it with our dogs and with pigeons, and we've done it with lots of different fruits and vegetables, why couldn't nature do it too, right? There must be traits that make them, some individuals, more likely to reproduce than others. I think we're going to stop here and then we will push on in the next lecture to some subtypes of natural selection.